On paper, Peru is one of the most water-rich countries in the world, 17th in fresh water per capita availability. Things should be great, right? The problem is that this water is very unevenly distributed. Basically, none of that water is where the people are, namely the capital of Peru, Lima, and its 11 million residents. Lima was never meant to be a megacity, an accident of history that has caused a watery havoc. In this video, we look at the water supply woes of Lima and Peru in general. In 1535, the Spanish started looking for a new capital for their mineral extraction colony, the Viceroyalty of Peru. The then capital of Jauja was located in the Central Highlands, but the crown-appointed governor Francisco Pizarro wanted to move the capital in order to be closer to a port located at the city of Callao. That port was shipping out the precious metals mined at the viceroyalties, and I love this word, upper regions of Cusco and Potosi. Scouts located a spot about 5 miles away from the Pacific coast. It was not only close to the ocean, but also airy and had good land. And amazingly, when the conquistadors arrived at this spot in the desert, they saw thriving farms, fruit trees, and willows, and so they chose to place their new capital here, which they named Lima. Residents are called Limeños. The area gets some peculiar weather. Peru today is the 19th largest country in the world, larger than South Africa, Chad, Nigeria, or Egypt, and just behind Iran. The Peruvian geography is very diverse. 60% of its land is covered by Amazon jungle, which is sparsely populated by humans, plenty populated by nasty animals that want to eat you. About 30% of the land is the Andes Mountains, snow-covered peaks, highlands, and valleys. Not a lot of people can live here. And then there is the 10% of country which is long and narrow and bordering the coast. This is where most of the population today lives, and it is a literal desert. This is because of the Peru Current flowing up from Antarctica. This cold water not only brings nutrients up from the ocean bottom, but also cools the coastal waters despite being in a tropical location, and thus rain clouds do not easily form. The result is a location that, interestingly enough, can get very humid and foggy, but at the same time gets extremely little rain, about 10 millimeters each year. So where is all this water for these farms coming from? The largest source of potable water for the Lima area is a river descending from the Andes, the Rimac. Glaciers up in the Andes melt to create water that travels for about 100 miles down 18,000-foot steep slopes of the highlands. The Rimac feeds into what is called the Rimac River Basin before emptying into the Pacific. The river is quite seasonal. Today, about half of Lima's rivers completely dry up during the May to December dry season. But during the spring, the Rimac River might swell and often flood, causing devastation. The Rimac River is Lima's only natural source of fresh water. The other option would be to dig wells, which was possible but not easy. The water table is deep and inaccessible without relatively advanced drilling technologies. Prior to the Spanish invasion, the Peruvian indigenous people had already built a network of irrigation canals that drew from the river to drink and irrigate their crops. The canals were cleaned and maintained by local laborers who received tools and food from their lords. The water would be shared amongst various social and ethnic groups, and political power came out of how this water would be distributed. When Pizarro founded Lima, he struck a deal with the local indigenous lord Talachujusco, later Don Francisco after his baptism. As the city quickly attracted new settlers, the city government, or cabildo, first connected their households to this existing water system. In the 1550s, the city had grown from just a few dozen men to over 3,000 Spaniards plus women, merchants, and mestizos. By the end of the 1500s, over 14,000 people lived in Lima. They dumped trash, sewage, and other waste into the Rimac, polluting it and making it undrinkable. Disputes broke out between the residents. There were some springs at the foot of the Santa Rosa and Quiros hills called the La Atarja, so in the early 1560s the government built a reservoir that collected water from it. Clay pipes then brought that water to the rest of the city. These pipes were about 30 centimeters wide, internally glazed, and wrapped in brick. The first fountain was completed and inaugurated in 1578. There was a great celebration where the city mayor threw silver coins out of his window. Wild times. Today, Atarja is the name of Lima's major water treatment plant, supplying 85% of the city's total water demand. More pipes were built throughout the late 1600s into the 1700s. Many of these lines served only the powerful. This included royalty, the cabildo officials like mayors and councilmen, and the religious institutions like the Dominicans, Franciscans, and the Jesuits. 82% of the water pipe capacity petitioned for and granted went to these religious institutions, at the time some of the most powerful people in the state. The lower classes, which not only included ordinary laborers, but also richer merchants and professionals, did not receive concessions for water pipe to their homes and neighborhoods, so they had to go to the public fountains. Or they purchased water through a water vendor or aguateros, who brought water by hand into the city from over the mountains. In those days, Peru had an active slave trade. People who wanted to drink better water than what they can get from the Rimac would send a slave on a donkey to the nearby slopes outside the city to fill 2 barrels of water. After slavery was later abolished in the 1850s, several freed water carriers banded together to create water guilds. They would bring water from a distant fountain and then sell it door to door on the streets. Peru's independence from Spain in the early 19th century coincided with a shift away from silver to guano, or bird poop. The guano export boom lasted for several decades as Peru cornered the world fertilizer industry. Annual GDP growth hit 4.7%, and guano made up 74% of total exports. The guano gravy train funded large government expansions. Peru's government earned 80% of its income from guano and spent half of that money on ambitious railroad networks and expanded government services. One service was public health. President Ramon Castilla wanted to improve Lima's water supply. Those old clay pipes first built in the 1570s needed to be replaced with iron ones. Water storage had to be expanded, and so on. So, with presidential support, a group of Peruvian businessmen founded the Water Company in 1855. 10 years later, in 1864, the company signed a 50-year contract with the government to supply water. Between 1858 and 1898, the water company laid down some 73 kilometers of iron pipe. That company is the ancestor of today's state-owned water utility, Sedapal. This contract basically privatized Lima's water supply, and because the company spent all that money, they argued the water belonged to them, causing disputes with the city and federal governments. This water shortage issue was exacerbated by the fact that in 1872, Lima removed its city walls, originally built in the 1680s to protect from attackers. With the walls now gone, new residents streamed in, and the city expanded, straining the water supply once more. The guano boom had a mixed effect on the Peruvian economy. Its financial benefits mainly accrued to the elites, namely the merchants and financiers. Average laborers saw little, widening the gap between the rich and poor. Worse yet, bread and butter prices rapidly inflated during the 1850s and the 1870s, driving up living costs and creating social unrest. Riots and uprisings took place in 1858 and 1872. The Peruvian guano boom ended in the 1870s when new artificial fertilizers made by the Haber-Bosch process won the market. The government's attempts to find its next big export sparked war with one of its neighbors. From 1879 to 1884, Peru and Chile, secretly backed by Spain, fought the War of the Pacific, apparently over nitrate taxes, it seems. Peru eventually lost the war, ceding the nitrate-rich province of Tarapacá. Thousands of Peruvians died. Economic activity in Peru collapsed by over 30%, though this helped alleviate the cost of living crisis. By the end of the 19th century, the average Peruvian was about 70% richer on a GDP per capita measure. Sounds great, right? But when taking into account the higher costs of living, the average working-class Peruvian was left 10% worse compared to how they were in 1825, as measured by welfare ratio, whether their wages can buy food for a family of 4. In 1913, just a year before the end of the water company's contract, the Lima municipal government bought the company outright. Foreign experts hired by the government pointed out that the water supply did not meet the drinking standards of the day. Water traveled through dirty irrigation ditches, including the ancient Surco quote-unquote river, more an irrigation canal, without any form of treatment. So the Lima city government, under the leadership of Mayor Luis Miro Quesada, took control of the water company and set about building a purification factory and chlorination plant near the Atarja Springs. For the first time in 400 years, the Limeños had potable drinking water. In 1920, this progress was interrupted when the Peruvian national government under President Augusto Leguía expropriated all of Peru's water companies. Water supply and street paving contracts were given to a New York-based company called the Foundation Company, which kind of does not make sense until you realize that Augusto moved to the U.S. after the War of the Pacific and got very rich as an insurance executive at the New York Life Insurance Company. Anyway, companies like Foundation did very well from these contracts. Then in 1929, the national government nationalized the water companies again, a status that has basically remained unchanged until the 1960s. Up until the 1940s, Lima's population grew rather slowly. In 1940, Lima had about 645,000 inhabitants, representing just 10% of the national population. But the post-war era brought a long period of prosperity. Driven by burgeoning economic demand for Peruvian goods like fish meal, the good times lasted through the 1950s, 60s, and the first half of the 1970s. Demographic changes brought people to urban areas. Lima's population grew at over 5% a year throughout the 1960s and 1970s. As you might expect, the city struggled to meet the needs of this growing population. In the late 1940s and 50s, the city built a total of 3,500 new homes, nowhere near close enough to accommodate the 30,000 to 50,000 new migrants arriving at the city each year. So the new arrivals stayed in barrios, informal settlements on seized land. They built the household first, only counting on receiving urban services like water later. By 1974, Lima had 371 such settlements, and they grew to host some 1.5 million people. Despite attempts in the 1960s and 70s to quote-unquote legitimize these barrios, they nevertheless divided Lima into quote legal and illegal residents. The government tried to build water pipes to some of these settlements, but the reality is that the quote legal parts end quote of the city, the so-called richer guys, tended to get their water first, leaving the less fortunate to resort to the informal water vendors. By the mid-1970s, Peru's per capita income was on par with Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. But the energy crises of the decade struck the country's economy a startling blow, ending its economic growth. Worse yet, the government did not respond well to these new challenges. Under a series of inept leaders, the Peruvian government implemented policies that caused high deficits, social instability, and even hyperinflation. The late 1980s saw some of the worst economic times. The young president, Alan Garcia, was elected on a platform committing to all Peruvians, but his administration oversaw a drastic downfall in the economy. Import restrictions, high tariffs, and an overvalued currency discouraged exports and agricultural production. These policies hurt the overall economy but benefited urban residents, incentivizing even more people to come to Lima. Then in 1987, Garcia attempted to nationalize the country's remaining private banks, which evaporated all business confidence in him. From there, the Peruvian economy rapidly collapsed. At the same time, a Maoist terrorist group called the Shining Path, or the Communist Party of Peru, fought a vicious guerrilla war to topple the government and establish a communist state. At its peak, the Shining Path had 3,000 armed members. They were formidable, and the government could not control them. They stalked the outskirts of Lima, following Mao's philosophy of starting in the countryside and choking off the cities. This affected mining, energy, and agriculture activities conducted outside of the city and caused people to flood into the city even more. The Shining Path declined in 1992 after the government captured its charismatic leader, Abimael Guzman. By 1989, only 18.6% of the population was fully employed. The inflation rate was 2,776%. Garcia's approval ratings, 90% in 1985, had plummeted to just 9%. Back in the growing megacity of Lima, the water problems were getting worse. Garcia's populist administration did not allow water and sewage fees to keep up with inflation. By 1989, fees for each cubic meter of water on a real basis cost less than half of what they did back just 4 years earlier. Those connected to the water system used their water wastefully, with few controls on their demand. Users did not often pay for how much water they used, either paying a flat fee, not having their usage metered, or just not paying their bill. In 1987, water consumption per capita in Lima during the wet season was 236 liters per day. This was more than what is consumed in European cities, about 150 to 200 liters per day. Some richer areas used as much as 567 liters, while poorer areas used as little as 105. For those 25% of Limeños without a connection, they can do nothing but rely on public taps, drilled informal wells, or expensive vendor water. The 1990 election was a major turning point for Peru, Lima, and its water system. The turmoil of the Garcia years led to the unexpected rise and election of Alberto Fujimori, a Peruvian of Japanese descent who spoke Spanish with a noticeable accent. In his early career, Fujimori was an academic and TV host. In the 1990 election, he started off as just another one of several candidates. He positioned himself as a relatively moderate political independent, but was not taken very seriously by the major players. However, divisions in the dominant left and right-wing coalitions lost them their support. There was a distinct desire to make a break from the past and go with fresh leadership. And thus, El Chino, perhaps a misnomer as he was Japanese, not Chinese, consolidated middle ground support and won a runoff against the novelist Mario Vargas Llosa by a large margin, largely by sticking to a vague generalized script defined by change. As the political newcomer entered government, the consequences of years of water mismanagement came to pass. In January 1991, doctors began receiving cholera patients in the northern parts of Peru. Cholera is caused by bacterial infection in the small intestine, famously resulting in high volumes of watery diarrhea. Cholera is a disease caused and spread by unsanitary conditions. Infected people drop their watery wastes into public drinking water sources. It was a terrible affliction back during the 1800s, but we don't hear about it today because of public water systems. It was Peru's first cholera epidemic in nearly 100 years. The disease swept through the country, infecting 1.3 million people and killing some 3,000, though some estimates go to 13,000. The death rate would have been worse had the public health authorities not reacted so swiftly to the news and brought fresh water and salts to the victims. But nevertheless, it spurred the government and people towards change. Fujimori ran as a moderate. He drew strong support from Lima, particularly in the poorer segments of the city. However, Fujimori ultimately followed many of the market-oriented policies espoused by his rival, Llosa, which were painted as potentially bringing economic shocks. Shocks, though, were ultimately unavoidable considering the dire situation. First was the readjustment of the water and sewage tariffs, among other public services. Prices rose by almost 80% in a single year. Many poorer Peruvians could not afford the higher water fees without subsidies from higher income users, which the water utility, Sedapal, often granted. Pricing regimes also had to change. Only a percentage of connections were metered, and a lot of people paid a flat fee for their water. However, the government was less successful in pushing these changes through. These price hikes were done as part of greater reform towards a potential privatization of the water utility Sedapal. From 1992 to 1996, stakes in over 100 state-owned companies in the oil, mining, electricity, and telecommunications sectors were sold to the public to raise money for government. Sedapal was listed as one of those companies. Later documents/scandals or what have you found that much of the sum $7 to $9 billion raised never benefited the people. Rather, it was stolen by members of the Fujimori government. But anyway. In preparation for life as a public company, Sedapal underwent many reforms. They implemented management and employee bonuses. They raised wages and invested in new infrastructure and maintenance. The World Bank encouraged this transition and even lent $600 million to prepare for it. But despite the utility adding 200,000 new water connections from 1989 to 2006, 30% of Limeños still did not have good water, in part because the city's population was still growing so fast. And like as I mentioned earlier, any pathway to better returns on investment and greater profitability would necessitate Sedapal to break the subsidization of poorer water users by the richer ones, and that would have been unpopular. The Sedapal privatization effort fell apart. Its status as a water utility made it less valuable than other state-owned entities like those in telecoms or energy. Selling just 35% of the telecom monopolies in early 1994 to the consortium led by Telefonica yielded over $1 billion alone to the Treasury. You can see why they put that first in line. By the time the government turned to selling off Sedapal in late 1994, it was getting perilously close to the next election. The Fujimori administration realized that Sedapal's new owners would mean higher water prices for lower-income customers. And if you recall, lower-income Limeños were a stronghold of Fujimori's winning coalition back in the 1990 election. So the Sedapal privatization was put on hold until the 1995 election, which Fujimori easily won. And then after that, the momentum was gone. The public, stung by higher electricity and telephone rates, had soured on the privatization drive, seeing it as a gift to the rich. Furthermore, Sedapal was no longer in crisis. Higher prices, improved management incentives, and a 23% reduction in headcount via voluntary retirements alleviated losses, meaning that Sedapal was turning a slight profit. So Sedapal was doing well. Notwithstanding the 1.7 million people in Lima who still do not have a water connection and all that. The 1990s were a time of strong economic growth for Peru. Inflation fell from 98% in 1991-1992 to just 6% in 1998. Real GDP growth was over 5.6% for the decade, taxes were simplified, and the government even turned a surplus. Debt was paid off, and the country returned to good standing. Thus, in 1997, the administration canceled the Sedapal privatization in its entirety and funded a $2.4 billion infrastructure campaign, 14% of all public investments spent during the 1990s, focusing on leakage control and laying down new pipe. The Fujimori government collapsed in 2000 in the midst of a run for a third term. For all the work the Fujimori government did throughout the decade, he was profoundly corrupt. This, in addition to the viciousness of his government's actions during the suppression of the Shining Path, caused a weight too great to overcome. His elected successor as president was Alejandro Toledo, who resumed many of Fujimori's neoliberal-oriented policies, and after a hiccup, the economy recovered. From 2002 to 2008, Peru was South America's second fastest-growing economy. Despite this, Sedapal's financials began to deteriorate again. Lima's population continued to grow, and acquiring enough water for those new residents cost a lot of money. But every time Sedapal needed to raise rates or curb demand, it caused pain for poorer people and grief for politicians. The 2006 election marked the return of the populist politician Alan Garcia. Yes, the same Garcia who in the late 1980s attempted to nationalize the banking system and spark Peru's economic collapse. Another surprising turn in Peruvian politics. During his second, ultimately successful presidential campaign, Garcia made the water issue a core theme of his message. He had the slogan, "Without water, there is no democracy," and promised a Water for All program, or APT, for Agua para Todos. APT was a public-private investment program. The vaguely defined goals were to achieve maximum coverage of drinking water and sanitation, improve infrastructure, and set up drinking water projects via private funding. In line with a commitment to market-oriented reforms, the Garcia administration in 2008 brought Sedapal shares onto the Lima Stock Exchange, essentially privatizing it, though the government still owns a majority of the shares. From 2006 to 2009, APT covered over 2,000 water projects, sewage treatment plants, water transfer pipelines, desalination, and so on. About 349 of those projects were in Lima, supposedly benefiting 1.2 million people. APT's private aspect means that investors will want to see a return on their investment. As the number suggests, Sedapal struggled to execute on these complicated water projects, and then there were the accusations of bribery and corruption in their conduct. A thesis done by Peter Medina Razuri at the National University of San Marcos later evaluated the APT projects. It appeared to have concluded that the APT did not set out with concrete, coherent goals to evaluate success other than the vague things declared by Garcia during his campaign, which in turn makes it difficult to decide whether or not APT was successful. Today, Lima continues to grow. Now utterly sprawling, the capital city is spreading onto hills and into river valleys, making it even more challenging to build water infrastructure for the residents there. APT's lasting legacy is to create one of the most complicated water systems in any city, a hodgepodge of reservoirs, storage lakes, wells, and more in a network stretching over 14,000 kilometers, with vendors and barrels patching it all together. Limeños continue to suffer from high water tariffs and water service outages, so they continue to rely on these informal water vendors and their own storage systems, as well as thievery. Some 30% of Sedapal's water cannot be accounted for. Fundamentally, water will always be expensive or scarce in Lima. Because it basically never rains, the water must always be pumped from deep underground, transported over vast distances, or stored in expensive spaces. Looking ahead, climate change brings even more challenges. The glaciers on the Andes Mountains that provide water for the Rimac River are likely to be affected, threatening serious droughts. So for the residents of Lima, despite living in a country with plentiful amounts of fresh water, the marginal cost of procuring that water will almost always be high, inflicting suffering on those who can least afford it. An accident of history with ramifications lasting over 500 years. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.